Okay, good morning. So I'm a big fan of keeping trains on time, and so we're going to get started with the second session. As I mentioned before, the second session has us looking outward, beyond the legal profession, beyond legal education, to other disciplines, specifically medicine and the military, to learn a little bit more about how they are addressing professional formation in terms of learning outcomes and culture. We will start with Dr. Eric Holmboe, who's the Senior Vice President for Quality Research and Academic Affairs at the American Board of Internal Medicine, and who has played a significant role in creating of the MILESTONES, the learning outcomes regime within graduate medicine. He was going to be joined by Dr. Robert Englander, but Dr. Englander got called away to an emergency a day or two ago, so he can't be with us. So Dr. Holmboe is being two people for us this morning. And then we will welcome Captain Wesley Huey, who's a professor with the Division of Leadership Education and Development within the U.S. Naval Academy, to talk about what's happening within the military. Each of them will speak for roughly a half hour, which again should leave about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So thank you.
All right, well, thanks very much for having me. I apologize Bob can't be here, but Bob and I have coordinated, so I look forward to sharing some of Bob's thoughts. What I'm going to do is kind of take you through a little bit of a journey in medical education. You heard a little bit earlier from William Sullivan about what happened in medicine, but I'm going to really talk about what's really been taking place over the last 30 to 40 years and why we've reached a particular inflection point. And for us in medicine, the early signals that despite the advances of the Flexner model and what had happened, that not all was well in medicine land, and there were increasing signals and evidence of problems, and they began to surface in the 1960s and 70s with recognition that there were problems in quality and patient safety. Archibald Cochrane in the UK was really focused on these issues of effectiveness and efficiency. Jack Wenberg in Vermont was beginning to detect basically unwarranted variations in practice among physicians in that state. And then Bob Brook at UCLA had begun to recognize that this issue of medical errors may be more pernicious than we had recognized. And there were others at that time. These are just three kind of pioneers. And as often happens in the early days, they didn't get a whole lot of attention, right? So there's signal, but a lot of people said, you know, probably not a big issue. But by the end of the 1970s, as you can see from this, this is the Association of American Medical Colleges, there were concerns, and now it's beginning to show up in some of the literature and coming from some of organized medicine. You can see here it says, sincere efforts have been made to improve its quality through establishing an accreditation system and expanding the certification of individual physicians. But further improvements in the overall quality of graduate medical education is still needed. So around this time, and I apologize, I'm actually now working for the Accreditation Council of Graduate Medical Education, still part of the professional regulatory system, but this is really the first time that a formal accreditation body is created for graduate medical education. That's the specialty training people go through in the States to become, I'm a general internist or a surgeon, et cetera. And also in the late 70s, the World Health Organization began to recognize problems globally. So this was a report that was put together really arguing for the importance of a competency-based approach. And they said the intended output of a competency-based program is a health professional who can practice medicine at a defined level of proficiency in accord with local conditions to meet local needs. And you clearly heard that theme from the first panel. And how do you prepare people to meet local needs? What are the social needs? You know, whether you define it as a market or a region, that really becomes a major issue. And so if you fast forward, you know, about another 20 years, as these signals continue to percolate throughout medical education, a watershed moment for us was first in 1999 and 2000 as To Err is Human report. that really demonstrated that quality and patient safety and errors were a really serious problem. In fact, this is the report that estimated that 98,000 people per year die for medical errors. And that was very controversial at the time, and sadly, it probably has turned out to be an underestimate. More recently, a study published last spring suggested that medical errors could be the third leading cause of death in the United States, depending on how you categorize it. So we have some work to do. And then in 2001, Crossing the Quality Chasm took a much deeper look at the kind of quality movement. And against this backdrop, by the late 90s, people began to recognize that as useful as the Flexner model had been, it was showing tremendous signs of strain, that it wasn't really preparing people to meet the kind of changing dynamic of healthcare. And so for us, in medicine, we began this competency journey in the 1990s. There's a recognition that we need to attend to outcomes, and competencies were seen as a model, getting back to Bill Sullivan's really useful point, as a way to operationalize it. And so the conversation began in the mid-90s. By 1999, Medicine for the United States had created what are called the 6 general competencies, and they were approved by the professional self-regulatory part of the system. My organization, the accreditors, and the place I used to work, the certification boards, and that was in 1999. In 2001, we actually launched formally something called the Outcomes Project, and all of graduate medical education was supposed to embrace these 6 general competencies. And for us, they are patient care, medical knowledge, professionalism, interpersonal skills and communication, and then 2 things called practice-based learning and improvement, which a lot has to do with self-directed learning and using evidence-based practice and getting people to recognize you will not come out knowing everything. It is impossible in this day and age for that to happen anymore. And the other was called systems-based practice. By the way, you work in a system. You work with other health professionals. That interprofessional, interdisciplinary work's really important. And so what we recognized is that we needed to reconceptualize our thinking a bit. At the top of this diagram, this is a really useful article from Julio Frank and colleagues. Dr. Frank is now the president of the University of Miami. He's a public health specialist, and said, for the last 100 years, we've really had this curriculum-driven model. It's been really helpful. We added structure to it. We incorporated science, which had been lacking. You heard earlier about that Hopkins was really exemplar. That's absolutely true with William Osler and others. And then we needed this clinical experience. But it wasn't attending to everything we needed. We wrote a lot of educational objectives. I don't know, do you write objectives in law school? Is that something you guys do? Do they end up mostly on the shelf? Yeah? They do in medicine, right? Oh, they're lovely, they look great, nobody uses them. And then our assessments, really were mostly about knowledge. If you're really smart, you're going to be fine. Oh, well, if you're a surgeon, we'll take care of that procedural stuff. But, if you're really smart, you're going to be okay. What they realized, that just doesn't cut it. And what you have to do is start with the health and healthcare needs of the systems and the people you serve. It's exactly what came up this morning, right? What are the needs of the population from a legal perspective? That's the starting point. And the competencies flow from those needs. That's why we have the 6 general competencies we have. They were really designed to meet the health and healthcare needs of systems and populations, and defined by better patient outcomes, reduced errors, more patient safety. And so that was really the driver. And the curriculum and assessment are really the last 2 things that follow, but they're critically important. So I was really struck by the discomfort around the assessment piece. No different in medicine, but you really can't run a competency-based program, or frankly, any good educational program without a good assessment program. You just can't. And the one thing I don't like about this slide is it makes it look like curriculum and assessment are separate as part of learning. They shouldn't be. They're an ongoing integrative function. And then Bob was part of this paper. And so in 2002, Carol Caraccio and colleagues wrote a really important paper saying, we got to get out of this time-based model, really think about what is it that people need to be able to do at each stage of career, coming out of medical school, coming out of residency and fellowship, and also what does continuing professional development need to look like? And we need to get out of what many of us call the tea steeping model of competence, right? Take a cup of hot water, stick a tea bag in it, and if you leave it in just the right amount of time, you get yourself a good cup of tea. Doesn't really cut it, right? We need to know what they can do. And so you can see this kind of paradigm shift. The structure and process paradigm that Flexner had really catalyzed in 1910 was very important, but we'd probably overdone it, and it was now becoming restrictive as we thought about where we needed to go. And so instead of like, you just complete a course of program, for me as a general internist, I had 36 months of training, 24 months had to be in direct patient care. Oh, by the way, I need a month in the ICU, month in the emergency department, you can have some electives and so forth. In other words, it's a bunch of building blocks. It's like a Lego figure. To think about like, what is it Eric has to be able to do when he leads? What are those abilities, right? The knowledge, skills, and attitudes that are necessary. And you can see that the driving force shifts from kind of the teacher being the sage on the stage and disseminating information to the learner being a primary driver in this system. The hierarchy becomes flattened because it has to be. So I was very excited in preparing for this, seeing this concept of co-education. I think that's really important. And so the responsibility becomes a partnership, right? It's that co-educator, the student and learner working together. And this is kind of the framework for evaluation. We tended to use a ton of proxies. If you take a test and you do really well on it, you're going to be a good doc. And that wasn't very authentic. Those proxies definitely correlate with future practice performance. I've done some of that research, but it's not authentic. And it only explains a small portion of the variance that people have when they're out in practice. And so, like I said, we used to have a lot of tests, right? I'm just curious for the students in the room. Tests, does that ring a bell? Do you guys take tests? Yeah. And instead, it has to be like, I'm going to watch what you do, right? I'm actually going to observe. You're going to keep a log of what you do. You're going to reflect on that log. You're going to be more self-directed. And the timing has to be ongoing and continuous so that it's driven by what's called formative assessment. Informative assessment refers to assessment that drives future learning forward. It's catalytic, right? So let's talk about how that went today. I noticed we're right behind the moot court. So if you're in there practicing, is there a debrief part of that? How do you break that down so that when the student goes back in there to do it again, can they do it better? Do they understand how to do that with more skill? And so the other big shift for us has been we've moved from a norm reference system. So Eric compared to Wes, well, Wes is a superstar. I think Eric's going to be okay. I think he's on track, so I think we'll give him a pass and move him on. Instead of like, can Eric actually do a procedure? Can Eric actually break bad news to a patient effectively? Can Eric manage patients with chronic disease like diabetes and heart failure and hypertension all at the same time, right? Not how I compare to Wes, but can I do those things? And that's a fundamental shift for us. So when you think about how to do this, this has really been how medicine's approached it, and these are slides from Bob. And as I said from the Frank article from McGahey earlier, you have to start with the outcomes. And so I definitely heard this morning, like, so is there clarity on the outcomes? That's critical. It's really critical for the profession or the discipline to understand what those are. That requires conversation. It just does. We certainly use an extensive literature review process to create these, but at the end of the day, the conversation was absolutely essential. That's why it's so exciting to see this happening here today. For us, and I'll get this to in a minute on the milestone, that conversation piece and defining the outcomes was critical, and they will change over time because medicine changes, right? Just give you one quick example. William Sullivan mentioned, we have two fields that are changing dramatically, radiology and pathology, right? Most people have been trained how to interpret an image. Either read a film or something now on a computer screen or read a slide. Guess what? Machines cannot do that. In fact, there's a program by Google called GoogleNet that can actually machine learn how to read films. It can read millions of films in a very short period of time. Anybody want to guess what that software cost? It's $1,000. What does it cost to train a radiologist? A lot more, right? And so their job is going to shift. They're going to be what, again, Bill talked about, they're going to become information specialists. That social skill and interpreting information, how to apply it, is now going to become much more important than like, can I read the film? Because machines are going to increasingly do that for us. And so that really gets to setting performance levels and standards, determine the assessment framework, then develop a curriculum, and you measure results. That's really the stepwise approach we're taking. So I'm going to walk through these steps. So again, the outcomes, the launch point coming out of law school or medical school or residency is critical because let's be honest, They're going to spend most of their time in practice, whether they're a lawyer, physician, nurse, engineer. They're not going to spend most of their time in school. That launch point, it turns out, in research and medicine is really, really important. It has tremendous impact on how they do and how well they actually perform. And for too long, we have treated competence as a ballistic function, right? It's like a rocket. If I just get the launch angle right and I get somebody high enough up into orbit, the good news is they'll retire before they burn up on a reentry. Not a good model, right? The goal is, how do you create a trajectory that continues that learning? And again, you heard that beautifully from the first panel. These are the 8 domains of competence that really cut across professional that Bob developed when he was at the AAMC. And some of the things you'll notice there are also personal and professional development and how important that is. Again, something you're grappling with around this professional identity formation is very front of mind right now in medicine, particularly given the high rates of burnout. Like your profession, we also have major issues with substance abuse in medicine, particularly in certain fields. Particularly those specialists that have access to substances easier than others. So these are kind of the 8 domains. So in addition to the 6 I mentioned, the 2 that have been kind of added across fields are, again, this kind of interprofessional collaboration and the personal and professional development. And it's an iterative process. We think very developmentally now. We have somebody come in to our system, but we know that they're not going to have a straight line. What are those steps that get them from being a novice to the point where they can lead, hopefully competent, maybe proficient, and then move toward mastery in their legal career? And I said these are the 6 general competencies that we came up with. And as I said, these were launched in 2001. But to be honest, it's been challenging. Simply putting these out there certainly helped build a mental model, but implementation was really hard. And educators really struggled, like, okay, I've got these new outcomes, but I've never taught them before. I can tell you as a resident, practice-based learning and improvement, system-based practice never came up. Systems, let me tell you how systems was defined. Eric, can you please get Mrs. Jones out of the hospital by 11 a.m.? We need the bed. That was the definition of systems when I was a resident, right? Not so good. Instead of like, how do we coordinate this patient's discharge? Because that's a really high-risk period for them. How do we make sure that's done effectively? And so we had this lack of mental model. And so what we did was begin to create something called milestones. Very simple concept. As you know, it's just a significant point in development, and using narrative and words and using a developmental framework, in this case that created by the DREYFUS brothers, who actually started, by the way, in the military with pilots. What does that trajectory look like? So that individuals know what their growth curves are, programs can recognize people who are either accelerated or need extra help, and to make sure that when they're developing the individualized learning plan, they know what's next. And so for us, what happened starting in 2007 is that the specialties took this general competency framework and they translated it into language for their specialty. And each specialty has its own set of milestones. And these are now the mental model that are used to guide training. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of that mental model that Bill Sullivan again talked about. It's critical in order to operationalize a competency-based approach. This is just the general architecture of a milestone. We have something called the general competency, and then there's a subset or sub-competencies. In this case, how to take a good history is a sub-competency. The milestones are the language, and we've divided ours into 5 levels, again, based on DREYFUS: novice, advanced beginner, competent, proficient, and expertise. We do not expect most of our residents to achieve level 5 at the time of graduation. The recommended target is level 4, right? So that gives them a framework, because we want to define what that first phase of their career needs to look like. Level 5 is really designed to think about, this is the next target when you leave us for your next 3 to 5 years. This is where you want to go. This is what you need to continue to work on. And so I said this was our journey. We started in 2007. And I just want to point out that these type of things are always long journeys. That's just the reality of it. They don't happen overnight. We published our first set of milestones in 2009. Then all the specialties began work in 2010. And by 2013, 7 specialties are now reporting milestone data twice a year to us that we can use to drive a national quality improvement. These are low-stakes part of accreditation. And we now collect information on 127,000 trainees spread out over 10,000 programs every 6 months. We are working now with about 2.6 million data points every 6 months, right? But it enables us to begin to really do some important stuff. And so for us, we've developed this model based on learning curves. This is a great article from Martin Pusick. I'm willing to bet the students feel that's exactly what their life looks like over 3 years, that steep part of the curve, right? I very much resonate with you. My son, by the way, is a recent graduate of law school and is now practicing in Washington. And when I shared this with him, I was going to come and talk. He was very excited. And he said, yeah, Dad, that's pretty much what it felt like. Unfortunately, it still feels like that. And I said, well, then that's good. All right. It's probably in the right place. And then for us, we use these milestones to guide this journey. And the milestones help to integrate the curriculum and assessment activities so that we're assessing the right stuff and we're teaching the right stuff. Okay? And this helps us to guide these curriculum. And as I said, students move at different rates. That person in green, they're doing fine. They're going to have their ups and downs. We know this isn't a linear process. That person in red, they're in trouble. We need to intervene early. The milestones are allowing us to do that. When somebody's off trajectory, we have a signal now and a way of measuring it. And so we can step in and say, you're struggling. And it could be in professionalism, communication skills, knowledge. But we have a way of picking that up now. That's been really helpful. This is what the self-regulatory system looks like for us in medicine. So again, I sit on the right-hand side. The accreditation and certification functions are the kind of assurance aspects of the system. Our primary constituency is the public, right? That's who we theoretically are supposed to answer to. But what happens inside the institution, much like here at the law school, is by far and away the most important thing, period. Right? We're only as good as what happens in there. That's really important. And because we're a self-regulatory system, we know that if people can't get certified, but they're able to get a medical license, and they're different in the states, those people are more likely to take care of who? The poor, because that's where they can get a job. So that feels bad. So making sure that we have the right combination of assessments. We use group process to make those judgments. We call it a clinical competency committee. They meet and they review all the assessment data, make a judgment around where the individual is, and then they feed it back to the student, who then uses that information to generate an individualized learning plan, and the cycle begins again, right? Always helping them to get better, understanding that trajectory. The information is also used to improve the program. Wow, you know what? We have a group of residents not doing well in this area. Maybe it's a curricular problem, and we've actually seen that happen already in some of our research. By having this kind of data, this is the sort of analyses we can now do. This is from OBGYN. We now can look at every single resident in the country and look at distributions and where they are developmentally. And you can see this one called Patient Care 5, which is actually stabilization of the newborn. You can see tremendous spread. Why is that? What's going on there? We can now use this as data to improve the national curriculum in obstetrics and gynecology training. We did not have that kind of information before. There was no information on patient care. Again, it was just knowledge. We can also look at curves, right? This is some neurologic surgery. And this has been really, you may find horrifying, but this has actually really been incredibly helpful. What we found was in neurosurgery, there's 8 domains of surgical practice that they are required to include in their curriculum. But when you added them all up, only 50% of neurosurgery residents, who by the way spent 7 years in their craft, learning their craft, had met level 4 in all 8. And you're like, oh my God, this is brain surgery. What's going on there? Well, it turns out that programs have variable access to various types of patients and domains, and not everybody's going to reach level 4 in everything. Turns out that's okay. They come out as unique packages. But we now know what they look like. We now know that, look, if you went to this institution, you're not going to probably be able to be proficient in doing epilepsy surgery. You might want to think about going somewhere else, or you may need to do a fellowship. That's what we can do with this data now, right? Because we can now look nationally every 6 months. So now that we have a framework and a mental model with milestones, how do we use them and this kind of information to make things better? And so assessment's a big part of what we have to do. And it's not something people wake up in the morning and go like, I am so excited today. I get to go assess a student, right? I'm curious, the faculty, do you wake up like really excited to go do assessment? If you have some of those in the room, I'd love to meet you, right? Because I'd like to distill it. And so what the general common milestones do is, again, it creates a conversation. It helps build mental models. You can begin to look at what the kind of, holism actually breaks down to. What are the important components of that? But they're somewhat reductionistic, and so how do we bring this more reductionistic piece back into the whole? How do we make sure when I can say to somebody, you know what, Wes, you're ready to become a lawyer. I no longer need to supervise you. You're good to go. You're going to be fine. And so we needed to come up with an integrative construct to help with that. And what has happened in medicine alongside the milestones that's been exciting is something called entrustability, right? And for us, we use this concept called an entrustable professional activity. Much of what was described earlier today are, in fact, the EPAs of law, right? Whether it be contract law, I've had a chance to talk to you some today, or you're doing immigration law, there's a certain set of activities that they're entrusted to do that you hope they do with a high level of proficiency. And so for us, this is what an EPA is. It's an important routine care activity. You could insert legal activity in there that define a specialty or subspecialty. They're observable and measurable. They require integration of the competencies. So I'll give an example. I'm a general internist. In order for me to do really high quality diabetic care, I need to have abilities in all 6 general competencies, not just knowledge. I have to work within a professional team. I got to coordinate lots of tests and referrals for my patient. That's systems, right? I got to be professional the way I do that. And entrustment means that they're ready to perform it without supervision. For us, this entrustment decision is a big deal, right? Because when they leave us, they're now going out caring for people. We're no longer there. There's no longer a safety net. There's no longer a faculty member or somebody else. They have to learn to develop that system for themselves. And so here are some of the important distinctions between competencies and EPAs. A competency, the unit of assessment, is the ability of an individual, where in an EPA, the unit of assessment is the activity itself, okay? EPAs are always embedded in a clinical context. It's embedded in the work you do, the actual activity. And so you could see where the EPAs would be very important around professional identity formation, because so much of socialization, identity formation is determined by what you do, the activities you do and how well you do them, right? And so I think that's a really important combination. So if we break down the EPA a little bit more, and this is nice slides from Bob, entrustment refers to the ability to effectively and safely perform a professional activity without direct supervision. I can tell you as a former program director, that's what kept me up at night, right? When I went home and I had a resident on call in the hospital, could I entrust them to really carry out a good history and physical, to make good treatment decisions? More importantly, could I trust them to know when to call me when they really didn't know what was going on, or a patient was basically headed south and getting really sick or crashing, right? That's a critical entrustment we have to make as clinician educators in medicine. And so trust is a big part of that. Can I trust them? Are they honest and trustworthy, right? Do they know when they don't know what they don't know, those sorts of things. So entrustment is a really important distinction. And again, it might be something that's helpful here in law. Professional is just the modifier of the activities, right? It's what you do. It could be an area of practice, a scope. Again, in law, I know there's lots of areas of legal practice, and so that plays a big role. And then finally, the activities really represent the essential work in that discipline. And it should lead to recognized outcomes. So if I'm caring for patients with diabetes, it should lead to good care for them. They should reduce complications. They should have good control of their blood sugars and their hypertension, et cetera. And I can measure that, right? So they're observable, measurable. I can measure whether the patient's blood pressure is better. I can measure whether their hemoglobin's in better control. I can ask the patient if they're activated and being able to manage their care well. And so Bob, created this really nice document where the EPA combines what he calls the domains of competencies, and then each domain can be broken down further into subcompetencies, what we call them in medicine. Some people just call competencies. And the milestones can then lay out the trajectory, and together they can create a story. So what they did for medical school is they basically have a narrative combining all the milestones based on EPAs of what an early learner looks like and what a learner should look like when they graduate. Somebody's entrusted now to move on to residency. And for those who are interested, this is the booklet. You can download it at the American Association of Medical College website. And I'm not going to go through these in any great detail. They're in there. But there are 13 core entrustable professional activities for entering residency that are now being piloted in a series of medical schools across the country. So even though medical schools are changing the way they deliver education, changing the process, They're now defined by these outcomes. So that's the work that's currently going on. And then here's the other 6. And you can see a lot of them are really core principle skills, okay? In the end, what we've also learned that you need both. So milestones and EPAs are critical for assessment. Again, competencies are more granular. They help you to understand the component parts of an activity. Think of them as kind of a telephoto lens. You kind of zoom in. They're very helpful with a struggling learner. Why isn't learner struggling? Is it a knowledge issue? Is it a communication issue? Let's take a look at those developmental trajectories. And then EPAs allow for the integration of the competencies. They're more holistic. Think of them as more panoramic as you zoom out. Is that person, you know, the lawyer you want them to be when they leave your particular school? And you can map these and create stories. And so that's what we've done. You know, we can begin to pull these two concepts together, and we can now describe in rich narrative language what this development looks like to become a professional in medicine, surgery, OBGYN, radiology, whatever it may be. So in summary, why EPAs? The other thing we've learned, they make sense to faculty because that's the kind of decisions they have to make. You make entrustment decisions all day long, right? When you're working with somebody, particularly in the care of patients in our clinical rotations. It can make assessment more reasonable by clustering activities. So you might think about what could you cluster in legal education that might make sense. It adds trust to the conversation, which has always been implicit for us, has now made it explicit, right? It really forces the faculty to think, is this person ready for additional responsibility? It's important to do that, but we want to base it on good assessment and a mental model of outcomes before we make that decision. I can tell you in medicine, here's how the decision was made about when I could see patients on my own in clinic without the preceptor having to be in the room. When I hit 6 months of training, because that's what the building rules allowed. Oh, congratulations, it's January. You know what, you can see patients on your own now. I don't need to be in there. Oh, that's great, right? That's not a good model. The question really should be, is Eric ready to do that, right? Am I ready to do that, right? And that can only be done through assessment. So the curriculum really is a major part of that. That should flow from the outcomes. If you're having, you know, gaps, then you fill those gaps in. For us, it's really been mainly focused on issues in quality and safety, and programs are building curriculum. And it's a real opportunity to rethink what it means to be a physician. It's been incredibly helpful because of these conversations. Perhaps the most important aspect of the milestones conversation was getting the communities together to talk about what they expected somebody to look like at the end of their training. And then finally, you should always build measurement into the process. That's really important. Measure what you do, because some stuff will not work. And when it doesn't, get rid of it, right? We have a terrible habit because, well, you know, we're physicians, lawyers, whatever. We're going to grind away until we make it work. Some stuff just doesn't work. Let it go. And so I'm going to stop there and turn this over to Wes.
I want to thank Professors Hamilton and Organ for inviting me to be a part of this great conversation. Also want to thank Marcy for all the work that she's done to organize things. As we all know, that's the hardest part of these kinds of conferences. And I also want to thank Karen for being good enough to come and pick me up at the airport at 10 o'clock last night, take time away from her family to do that. I want to start by just telling you a little bit about who I am, because I think understanding who I am and what I've done in my career will help you understand how we at the Naval Academy are trying to get at this notion of professionalism and professional development. So I started my career as a normal officer, graduated from the Naval Academy, and then went off on a standard operational career flying airplanes. I did that for 20 years, and then I had the opportunity to go to graduate school, University of Maryland, go Terps. Sorry, they're in the Big Ten now, so I shouldn't be too loud about that. Graduate school for 4 years in sociology. I became a sociologist in the middle of my life, which is a really interesting experience. And then I went back to the Naval Academy to teach, and I've been teaching leadership there for the last 7 years. So I'm about to retire here in this summer. Been teaching now the core courses in leadership that we teach to midshipmen. Every midshipman gets a leadership class every year of their 4 years. Midshipmen is what we call our undergraduate students at the Naval Academy. The reason I wanted you to know that was because I have this sort of interesting mix of theory and practice. I'm kind of the embodiment of that very thing that we've been talking about. How is it that we integrate these two things? Because in terms of leadership and professionalism, we know that both of those aspects are really important. And the question is, how do you integrate those two things to have a meaningful model and to come up with good developmental frameworks? And so the Navy has been pretty thoughtful about how we go ahead and do that. And it started with people like me that have both an operational background, have been out there practicing as operational commanders and as leaders, but also have a sort of a disciplinary expertise in the science, the behavioral science and organizational science of the professions. And so as a sociologist, I was exposed both to the macro level sociology, the sociology of institutions, and the sociology of professionalism, and also to the micro-sociology of how do you lead people. And so I've used both of those in my teaching, but most of my teaching has to do with the micro-sociology of human interaction. How do you cultivate good, healthy relationships? And that's really the foundation of our leadership program at the Naval Academy. So what I want to do now is tell you that I was reorged. I was basically downsized out of my job this past summer. We did a reorganization at the Naval Academy where I was the director of the division responsible for delivering professional and leadership education to the Naval, to midshipmen. I effectively got kicked out of that job. The Naval Academy decided that they wanted an operational officer, somebody that looks like me but is not an academic. They wanted that kind of officer leading that division at the Naval Academy. So I had to find something to do for my last year. So what I did was I went to the Commandant of Midshipmen, who's the equivalent of the Dean of Students at the Academy, and I said, look, Commandant, I've been here for 6 years now. I think I know some of the things that I know the things that we do well. I know the things that we need to work on. And I'd like to give me permission to go off and do a project that I think I can really go after what it is that we need to work on a little bit more. And that had to do with professional development. So he allowed me to do that. I spent the summer talking with folks like Neil about how they do it in the law profession, colleagues of Eric's about how they do it in the medical profession, and I also went to some of our centers of excellence within the military to talk to them about how they do professional development. And what I found out was the law profession, the medical profession, they're a little bit ahead of us in terms of thinking about professionalism as a unique and distinct developmental domain relative to the military. And I say that because when you talk to military experts on this topic, it's hard for us as military officers to distinguish what professionalism is as distinct from leadership. We tend to think of those two things as the same thing. How is character development different than leadership development, different than professional development? I think in the military we have a hard time making that distinction. I think with the competency-based models that Eric has just briefed and some of the things I've heard on the first panel, there's a much better sort of institutional understanding of what professionalism is and how it needs to be developed, perhaps even distinctly from those other things, leadership and character. So I want to tell you that I'm learning quite a bit sitting here listening to you talk about this. So what I want to do is I want to take you through the journey I've been so far in proposing, what did you say, Bill? Reframing of education in the profession at the Naval Academy. And really I'm talking about military professional education. One of the places I visited when I did my great tour this past summer on centers of excellence was the SEAL school, the school that's responsible for training our SEALs that is down in Coronado, California. One of the things he told me was that they discovered, it was a rather dramatic revelation for them a couple of years ago, that they were graduating people who were highly competent. They were incredibly competent, very tactically proficient SEALs. They could do all of the things that SEALs have to be able to do to accomplish their mission. But what they found out was they were graduating these individuals and nobody wanted them on their team. They were good tacticians, but they weren't very good at getting along with people. They weren't very good at having a team orientation. So they discovered a fairly significant hole in their training and education process that they went ahead and addressed. And I like to think that it has something to do with character. So they were very competency focused, but not enough character focused. And so they changed a lot of the things, the way they do business. It had to do, he introduced me to a sort of an assessment model that was built around this idea of identifying those elements of character that were important and then measuring those things along the way, so that it wasn't this big surprise at graduation that somebody was highly technically proficient but nobody wanted them on their team. So they built a set of, I think it was 4 different areas, domains that they thought were important. One was teamwork, and they built word pictures that described what it is about teamwork that they wanted their SEALs to be able to model. And if they weren't, achieving that word picture along the way, there was interventions built in. It was a 360-degree sort of model where they were being evaluated on teamwork, not just by their supervisors, but also by peers and subordinates in the course of their development. So again, being exposed to sort of the macro sociology, the sociology of professions in graduate school, Huntington is sort of Samuel Huntington is the main theorist for us. He was the one that tried to elevate military professionalism up there with the classic professions, yours included, of the Middle Ages. So according to Huntington, the military professions deserve the same status, the same place in society alongside the clergy, the law, medicine. And it was built around this idea that there were 3 elements that we all had in common. One was that we provide a service to society that is invaluable. In fact, society becomes imperiled if we don't competently deliver the service that's required to society. So it's a really important service. The second is that we have this corporate understanding of ourselves, that we have an understanding that you have to have some barrier of entry, you have to have some ability to prove yourself as competent, minimally competent in order to enter into the profession. And then the third, of course, is that you're self-policing, right? So you have ways to hold each other accountable to the standards of competency and expectation. So I brought that understanding of military professionalism into the Naval Academy as I began to teach midshipmen how to lead. And I realized very quickly that we had this hole in our program. And the hole was that we were teaching people how to lead, and we were even teaching them how to be honest, because we'd kick them out if they told a lie, or if they stole something, or if they cheated on an exam. So we were teaching them these things, but I don't think we were very effective at teaching them the understanding of what it meant to be a professional military officer, that it was more than just being able to lead. In fact, a lot more if you happen to be the kind of leader that led from this sort of charismatic sort of way of thinking about leadership, where you just walked into a room and let your personality shine, and people were bound to follow you. There is a much more fundamental sense of trust that you have to establish with all of your followers, not just the ones that you like or the ones that look like you, but all of them. That was important, and that had something to do with professionalism. So I spent a couple of months writing, thinking, talking to other people, and we developed this framework that I'm going to now brief you on today, and I'd love to hear your feedback, where we are on this framework. And again, referring back to Bill's remarks earlier, this notion that we have to have a reframing of education in the professions, that reframing must have a catalytic role, and that it must give rise to a model. I'm hoping that I've got an example of that exact thing for you here today. So this is the brief that I presented to the president of our college, which is the superintendent of the university. We're pitching it as a way to think more carefully about how we develop midshipmen morally. How can we bring more precision to the moral development of midshipmen? And what I found that happened as I started to think about this was the integrating function of this idea is really gets at the notion of professionalism. So professionalism became the centerpiece of this project. So we started by talking about advancing the moral development of midshipmen. A couple of years ago, we did an analysis of the honor concept at the Naval Academy. It's interesting how we develop, or how we measure moral fitness among midshipmen. We measure it by measuring the absence of a negative, which is to say that if a midshipman does not lie, cheat, or steal in the course of their 4 years going through the program, we say that they're morally fit, and off they go. That's not that simple, but that's the only official, sort of measurable, quantifiable metric that we use for moral development. Obviously, that's not all that moral development is. So the Academy made a statement in evaluating its honor concept, and it says that more than just this honor program and this system where we hold people accountable for moral lapses, we should instead develop a master plan. There needs to be a master plan, and the words used in the report was for leadership development that affects everybody at the Naval Academy, not just midshipmen, but all the staff, faculty, and coaches that do that important influencing and shaping of character and competence. And so this project was sort of billed to the superintendent as a way to answer that, what we felt was a very worthy and very bold goal. So like everything in the military, and especially at the Naval Academy, we always refer back to our mission statement. Anytime we launch on a project or any kind of endeavor, we try to ask ourselves what it is that we're about to do, how is that linked to our mission? The mission of the Naval Academy is to develop midshipmen morally, mentally, and physically, and to imbue them with the highest ideals of duty, honor, and loyalty. And this is a really important part of the mission statement because it says, in order to graduate leaders who are dedicated to a career of naval service. And then there's other words at the bottom that talk about, inculcating this sense of lifelong service as a citizen, whether you go on and serve in command or citizenship or government positions, you always have this internal sense of service. But that middle phrase is really important. So we don't do development just for development's sake. We do development to produce a particular kind of person that has a particular sort of ethos. So we're sort of built, as an organization, we're built for this notion of developing people professionally, in my view. And in fact, as a total institution, basically what the Naval Academy is, we have complete, and utter control over what, the context of midshipman development for 4 years. We ought to be able to do this fairly well. So what I did next was I tried to, and we were talking about Venn diagrams earlier, I tried to put on a single slide the different domains of development and how they relate to each other. And you can see if we do this with any degree of sort of precision, we get a fairly complex picture. So let me see if I can describe this adequately to you. So again, the mission statement of the Naval Academy says, midshipmen are developed morally, mentally, physically in order to graduate leaders. The moral dimension is abbreviated there using MD. It's the MD circle at the top. The mental development domain is the ND, and then the physical development domain is the YD. You can see we think of these as distinct domains of development, but then ultimately, obviously, overlap. There's obvious overlaps between moral and physical development. And then within those that interlocking circles there, you have leadership development and character development that we believe occur at the nexus of all three of those domains. So we're developing leadership and character at the intersection of these three distinct domains. So this is the part that's new to the Naval Academy. Everything I've said so far is fairly well understood by everybody that works there. The part that's new is this notion of an overarching construct of professionalism. And we're talking about it in the sense of pulling together all of these different domains of development so that it's a whole and it's greater than the sum of its parts. And so you notice obviously there's areas outside of the circles there that remain within the circle of professional development that we think that's where the magic is, right? If you can pull together, again, mind, body, and soul is another way to talk about mental, moral, and physical. If you can pull those things together in a way that's integrated, then we believe that you achieve something greater than just the sum of those domains of development. And that's what we're trying to figure out how we operationalize. What is it that happens to midshipmen that make them worthy of the commission that we have them sign, worthy of leading men and women of all stripes, of all sizes, into situations in which they could lose their life, worthy of delivering orders that sometime result in the loss of life and the destruction of property? How do we develop people that are trustworthy enough to do that ethically? So obviously it's a really important thing that we think that we have to be able to do well. But to be honest with you, we haven't thought, as an institution, we haven't thought of integrating these three domains of development before in a very serious way. We can measure physical development really well. We can measure how fast somebody runs a mile and a half. Okay, and we have very distinct standards on that. You have to run a mile and a half, if you're curious, as a midshipman. As a male midshipman, you have to run a mile and a half in 10 minutes and 30 seconds. And if you can't do that by the time you graduate, you don't graduate. It's that simple. We can measure mental development in the sort of traditional way that we think about measuring mental development, right? A grade point average. We have a 2.0 minimum. You have to graduate with a 2.0. If you don't graduate. Much harder to measure moral development. And again, we all believe intuitively that measuring it by the absence of a negative isn't enough. Okay, so I've just basically described this slide to you. We have proposed a reinvigoration of the notion of professionalism to be the unifying construct that brings these three important but distinct areas, domains of development together: moral, mental, physical. And we've come up with a model that we think is rides that balance between not being too prescriptive, because we don't want to prescribe, too much in this hard to define domain. We actually would rather it be built by the experts, built by the faculty, staff, coaches, and midshipmen. We want it to be collaborative. We want them to sort of develop this model, but also provide enough of a framework that we have a starting point we can talk about. And so that's what this is. So we have we built it's got a kind of a nautical theme. It's this idea that you have a compass that serves as your guidepost for professional development. And I'll just talk about these 4 poles that we've identified. And again, this is the way that we're thinking about modeling and operationalizing professional development. At the North Pole, you have what we believe to be perhaps the most important one, and that is this notion of character and identity. We talk about character and identity together because we believe that really they are sort of inseparable. Midshipmen have a very difficult time understanding identity, professional identity, and it's because, again, in this total institution in which we have them emerged, they want to ask me, when I'm teaching, they want to ask me, "Sir, what does it mean to be a professional? What does that mean to you? Describe to me how you came to an understanding of what that meant." I said, I tell them one of the ways that I think about it that's important for you to think about is that it's a part of who I am, a really important part of who I am. In fact, it's a part of who I am even when I'm not in uniform. And that makes their head explode. They say, "Are you telling me that I have to be a professional all the time, everywhere? Even when I'm on leave, home for Christmas? That I have to think about myself as a midshipman?" And I say, yes, I think that is what it means. It means that the way that you think of yourself as a military professional applies all the time, everywhere. And so, when you're embarking onto a new relationship with a significant other, when you become a parent. You think about your parental responsibilities and being ethical in the way that you raise your children as just as important as being ethical in the way that you lead your sailors and Marines. And in our view, it's sort of it's a concept that doesn't come with the uniform. It's who you are, not just in uniform, but all the time. So that it takes a while for that to sink in for them, for them to sort of understand the implications of that. And in fact, the way we teach our classes is we give them an exposure to professionalism and the professional identity early in their program, because once they pass the first class of their junior years, they become committed to the Naval Academy, meaning that if they leave after that point, they have to repay their education. They have to repay, I don't know what the total dollar value of that is, but it's a lot of money. So we try to give them a very clear understanding of what they've done, what they've joined, by the time that they have to make that commitment. So by the time they're juniors, they have a clear understanding that this is a sort of at least a career-long striving, if not a lifelong striving. I don't think we hold people accountable for being military professionals after they've retired, but I have to say I have an expectation that military officers who are identified as retired military officers act ethically, right? So the North Pole is character and identity. On the South Pole, we talk about wisdom. Wisdom, of course, is really difficult to define. It's one of the cardinal virtues. We think about wisdom as sort of this blend of experience and knowledge and judgment, and also the dogged pursuit of truth. And so when we talk about wisdom, we think of it as paired with character, because we do believe that character and wisdom develop together, and we think they're mutually supportive of each other. And so I'll tell you about what I mean by wisdom. It's the ability to make, ability to discern courses of action that attend to multiple and sometimes competing perspectives, including perspectives that are paradoxical or self-contradictory. I'll give you an example. We tell the midshipmen about the self-paradox of professional development. This idea that, when they show up at the Naval Academy, many of them have never failed in their lives before. They've never had less than an A on an exam. These are phenomenally talented young men and women. But the first thing we tell them is, congratulations for being here. It's not about you. Well done. It's not about you anymore, right? It's this idea that it's now about the mission, it's about the team, it's about serving others. That's the foundational element of being a military officer, not about your own personal talent. Great that you're that talented, but so is everybody else, by the way, and it's not about you. At the same time, we say, it is about you. You have to develop yourself. You have to prioritize your own development in a meaningful way. It's got to be moral, mental, physical. It's got to be almost all-encompassing while you're here at the Naval Academy. If you don't develop your skills and your abilities and your knowledge here, when is it going to happen, right? So there's a paradox there. We tell them there's a paradox about being a warrior. We say that in order to be an effective warrior, you have to be both highly skilled in what you do, highly lethal, in fact, but also very wary about that power, and not become too enamored, or enamored at all, frankly, with that skill. So you have to be both very good at it and also hope that you never have to use it. There's a paradox there. So we talk about wisdom in that way, that it sort of reveals some real contradictions in our ethos. On the horizontal axis, we have on the right side of the screen there, the heritage pole. This notion that you have to understand where you came from in order to understand well who you are and where you're going. And that's linked in the horizontal with this what's already been described, a competency-based model of knowledge, skills, and abilities, things that military personnel have to be able to do well. And the reason that those are arrayed the way they are, the heritage and the knowledge, skills, and abilities in the horizontal, is because we believe there's a sort of a temporal, kind of an earthly sort of dimension to that, right? This is stuff that we know how to do, that's our human experience. The things that we have in the vertical, though, there's something almost otherworldly about it. The dimension that there's something mystical, something spiritual about having good character and divining wisdom. It comes from something even beyond ourselves. So there's a purposeful way to the way that we've arrayed that compass. So this is the framework. I've been given the 5-minute warning. I had a few other slides. We can talk about those offline if you'd like. But this is sort of getting at this notion that Bill talked about, that one of the things that we have to overcome in the military is that within our institution, we don't have a good enough sort of understanding of this distinction between professionalism and leadership. We often think those are the same things. That if you're a good leader, you're a good professional. I believe that leadership is just it's an element of character, it's an element of who you are, but it's also an element of what you know and what you do. But I think it's a very small subset, actually, of what professionalism demands of you. And so this is our first attempt to sort of throw some spaghetti on the wall, if you will, and think carefully about how you can develop and operationalize this broader concept. Again, the notion that pulling these domains of development together give you a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank both of you. I want to just quickly observe, I've occasionally thrown spaghetti on the wall and it's never come out like a compass. Just never. So you guys are really gifted, apparently. All right, questions? Why don't we start here and then if you can get there.
I actually have a question. Is it Dr. Holmbo?
Yes, please, Eric.
So in thinking about the different component parts of professional identity formation in medicine and how they may have application to professional formation identity in law, and I want to focus specifically on this idea of the entrustable professional activities. Yeah. There are articles and reports that suggest that bedside manner or an empathic approach to patients yields better patient outcomes. So I'm wondering whether or not this is one of the criteria that helps you determine whether or not a resident or a student who's going to actually practice alone is entrustable. And if so, do you teach this as part of your more general teaching?
Yeah, it's a great question. You're absolutely right. There's good research that shows the association between good communication skills and empathy with actual outcomes. It is a major part now of what we teach. We use the principles of patient-centeredness, and really there's several ways it's now being operationalized. Back in the 70s, George Engel at Rochester talked about the biopsychosocial model, the need to attend to both the psychic and social aspects of the patient. That was radical at the time, by the way. Medicine was very paternalistic and doctor-centered. So that's a major part, and what you'll see in the milestones are those principles deeply embedded both in the interpersonal skills and communication, competencies, as well as professionalism, and so there's some overlap there. So that's part of the trust, right? So if somebody has poor communication skills, then we're increasingly spending more time measuring that, and there are ways of getting at that. There are various patient survey instruments. They've gotten better in measuring patient experience, not just satisfaction. And we also have observational tools now that we can use to look at patient-centeredness. I can tell you, for me, when I was a clinician educator, that was one of the, I'll use the concept of axes here since I got a compass in front, I love it, is that, if that person's really a jerk, I really worry, about entrusting them to work overnight, not only in how they treat patients, but also how they're going to work with other professionals. This is not a solo sport anymore. And what we also know that physicians who not only treat patients poorly, but treat other members of the team poorly, there's a higher risk that, for example, safety or risk will not be reported, all right, because of the fear, of having to deal with the bad behavior. So this has become a major component of what we not only attend to in teaching, but also what we assess.
He's coming.
Hi, I thought that was a terrific panel. I'm Mitch Balin. I'm the Dean of Students at Georgetown Law. I want to be called the commandant of students now, if I can.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to take that home as one of the things that I've learned. I'll be pretty candid. We're the biggest law school in the country as far as number of JDs. Outside of our clinical program, which is not required, we set milestones that have an economy of scale, right? We grade and exams are the way in which we see whether students meet milestones. So we set them where it's cheap to do that. And then we set them at a level where virtually every student will meet the milestone, right? Not the milestone and then see which students meet it. Yeah. So Dr. Holmbo, you are describing a very different model for us. And the first word that leapt into my head as you were talking was cost. Does it cost a hell of a lot more to do what you're talking about in medical schools, and how might we think about translating that to law schools?
Yeah, and I'd be happy to have this, a longer conversation, because as you can imagine, there's a lot of complexities. By the way, my son's best friend is a student currently at your school, so very, very nice to meet you. There's several things. I mean, to be perfectly honest up front, I think what's happened in professional education for too long is we tried to do it on the cheap, and we're paying for it. I showed you some data, but I could show you a lot of really sobering data around medical errors, patient safety, the lack of patient-centeredness, and guess what? When people come out, that has a tremendous cost to the system. And the problem is the schools, and I'm with you in this, I train people, we don't pay a price for that, right? They go out and it's no longer our problem. And so there's no kind of, connection or accountability, or I think enough accountability in the system for that. And it's unfortunate, because we now have pretty good evidence in medicine that people's launch point is profoundly impactful, that the habits they take out of residency imprint onto them, and that imprint appears to last for 15, 20 years. So if you come out insufficiently prepared, you take that with you. And there's been some studies around, for example, complications with deliveries. If you train at an institution that does it poorly, guess what? You do it poorly as a practitioner, and that never goes away, all right? And so there's that component. I think we just have to be honest with ourselves. The other component is to think about how to integrate and embed more of this into existing, and I think that's actually quite possible. So a lot of what programs have done is they realize that there's a lot of activities that have value, for example, on an assessment side, but they never get captured. And so we've created ways to take advantage of those collisions or interactions between faculty and students and capture them in more effective ways. We're using a lot more in the way of just apps, using natural language processing to capture observations that then create a holistic picture of the student moving forward without necessarily having to give a test or fill out a scale. There are several of those now that are in increasing use. I think the third is activating the students to be more involved in their assessment and these type of activities. But we have to give them a framework, and we have to give them guidance to do that. You can't just say, like, listen, go assess yourself more. What's the framework against which they assess themselves against? What's the mission, And I think for medicine, the milestones have been incredibly helpful, because in our research work with residents, they say, I now know what the end state's supposed to look like, right? And now I have a way of getting there. And so I can take more responsibility for that activity. And so we, using individualized learning plans and giving them, guidance for the self-direction has been really helpful. But I can just say, and I'm happy to talk more, I empathize with your challenge, because I'll just give you an example for medicine. Many of our internal medicine programs are incredibly large. As many as 170 residents at any given time, spread out over multiple hospitals. They're having the exact same problem you're having because of the lack of continuous exposure with any single faculty member. What you get are fragments. And if there isn't a system to connect those, then you run into challenges. And so our programs that are probably struggling the most are in your boat. They're large, and they're struggling to develop systems. And they're getting there. They're figuring out ways to create, if you will, hubs, to kind of concentrate this in not like one big grouping, or hubs, for example, in the Clinical Competency Committee. That actually helps a lot. Giving people advisors so there's a connection there. Using technology. I'd be happy to talk to you more, but the size is a real issue, even in this system, no question.
Over here, and then get Professor Madison.
Hi, I want to thank you both for sharing this morning. It strikes me that the legal profession has a different hierarchy and autonomy dynamic of the students than medical students and military midshipmen. And I wonder how you think that impacts things. When students have a broader discretion over the elective credits they pick, over their clinical experiences, internships, it's certainly not the military where the program is prescribed. And it seems that we in the legal profession have more autonomy as students than in the medical profession and medical schools. So how can educators wrestle with that dynamic, that they can't just decree a learning outcome? What do you suggest?
We're going to start, then I'll go after you.
Yeah, we consider, actually, this is one of the paradoxes that we talk about in this context of wisdom. We talk about the paradox of autonomous obedience. One of the things that we say is really important to us, and for good reason, is this notion of obedience. As a military, you have to know that at some level, if you give an ethical, legal order, that it needs to be carried out, and sometimes it needs to be carried out quickly. What we try to infuse our midshipmen with is the understanding that at the same time they're developing this value of obedience, they have to also develop this value of autonomy and intellectual autonomy, right? The ability to separate yourself enough from a problem that you can evaluate it. Even if it's in the split second that you're getting the order, you have to somehow distance yourself enough from this obedience, foundational value, distance yourself enough from it to be able to act with a certain degree of autonomy. And we say that's sort of a paradoxical idea as well. I had a student in my office the other day who asked me frankly, he said, "Sir, is there room for me in this profession? Because I really do have a rebellious sort of spirit and a rebellious way of thinking about, the things that I'm exposed to." And I told him, not only is there room for you, we really need you to sort of continue to cultivate that rebelliousness within reason, obviously, but it's critical. And we tell our students this notion of, critical thinking gets a lot of sort of, it's almost become a slogan. We talk about it so much, but we really do believe in the cultivation of wisdom at the Naval Academy. We really do try to make sure there's room for autonomy, intellectual autonomy in our classrooms. Now, do we achieve that at the same level as perhaps St. Thomas Law School? Probably not, but I do believe it's an important paradox that we think is valuable.
I would just make a couple observations. I think one is I like the concept of flexibility within an educational program, but I think at the end of the day, it has to center on a set of outcomes, right? And I think students need that guidance to know where they're headed. So when they put an educational program together, you want to make sure it has meaning. I'll give an example that actually worked out quite poorly for medicine. Was this concept of having a major that was pre-med. And so, these schools that create these tracks, and if you didn't get into medical school, guess what? You have nothing that really is going to be useful at the end. And so that's an example of, great flexibility. You can design a program, meet these requirements, and you'll get ready for pre-med, but what are you coming out as? So where I trained, you had to choose a major. I think that was actually wise. And then I had flexibility within that major about how to construct it. And so I think this is where faculty and the models are so important. It's interesting, you know, medicine is often seen differently, but I work with a gentleman named David Berg. He's an organizational psychologist at Yale. He's worked with many different professions, including a lot of time with the military. And he says the most hierarchical profession he's ever worked with is medicine. Worse than the military. And I would agree with that. I'm actually a retired naval officer, despite what I look like today. So, you know, we really struggle with the hierarchy. On the one hand, we value autonomy probably to a degree that's unhealthy, and yet we have sometimes this blind obedience problem that I heard earlier today. And so the concept we're working with around autonomy, we call it relational autonomy. Autonomy has to be earned in relationship with how you work with others. And for medicine, that relational aspect of autonomy is critically important, as it is in the military. You know, having spent some time deployed with the Marines, their relationships with each other and how they work together is a life or death thing. And so they have autonomy to exercise the task, so to speak, but they have to take orders and they have to be connected with others within that battalion or whatever it is, or the consequences of not doing that well can be fatal.
Thanks. Mike Madison from the University of Pittsburgh. I'm going to ask a cousin of the question that I asked to the first panel, which is, to what extent do you see challenges to or needs to adapt the frameworks that you've laid out in light of evolving changes in the, we'll call it sort of the practicing professional environment in your respective disciplines? The question is prompted, I guess, partly by what you've been talking about in the last couple of answers, but also I had a conversation just the other day, 2 days ago, with a colleague of mine at the business school at Pitt, who was talking about how she is now actively involved in providing professional continuing medical education to physicians at the largest medical enterprise in Pittsburgh, which is UPMC, where all the physicians who are, we'll say, sort of 3 to 8 years into post-MD practice are coming to her saying, we need to know more about organizational behavior, teamwork, project management, strategic planning. So all of these non-clinically related skills that fall generally into the cluster of professionalism and that are in much greater demand now because the mental model of a physician as a semi-autonomous clinical provider is being rapidly displaced by physicians moving into large-scale, we'll just call them medical industrial organizations. They are employees rather than sort of independent professionals. Still, you know, the ethical framework still apply, but the organizational context is very, very different.
So I would argue it a couple of ways. One is, you know, we're kind of approaching it from both ends. So we're trying to continually build out those skills, more and more of those into residency and medical school training. There's a very fascinating project right now being run through the AMA called the Accelerating Change in Education Project. And some of the schools who've been funded to do this are doing exactly that. In fact, there's a new textbook just written by those collaborators on system thinking in medical school. And Mike, it gets to all the stuff you're talking about. How do you prepare people better for these skills we just need today? On the other end, what we call CME or now CPD, Continuous Professional Development, is really de-emphasizing the issue around knowledge, you know, kind of seat time, and more kind of experiential, interactive activities that incorporate these activities, bring in systems thinking, all the things you just talked about into those activities, and then give them credit for it. So I think where we've made some progress, Jerry, I think you alluded just earlier, is that giving credit for stuff around quality and safety and systems and interprofessional work now counts. You can get credit for that as part of your licensure and maintenance of certification. That's been really helpful. So we're kind of hitting it from both ends. I think there's two things I would point out. That the milestones in the EPAs are a way for us in medicine to operationalize the competencies in a competency-based system. And certainly the stuff Wes talked about is critically important. That is part of the model, but and I love the way he kind of surrounds it. Having said that, the principles, I think, of CBME, whether it be competency-based in education, law, I think hold up very well, no matter what profession you're in. And so I think as you look to move forward, both in law school and then the continuing legal education, how can those principles help really get at what you're tackling, right? You know, the medicine, you can hear what's happening, and that's what they need, and that's why those CPD programs are tailored to that more than ever. how can you use those principles around competencies to help folks even in legal practice potentially pick up new skills, modify skills, et cetera. And I think the principles hold up very well. And again, Mike, I'm happy to share some work from Elaine Van Mel that really lays out the key principles to a competency-based model.
All right. Thank you very much. Could we please express our gratitude?
Yeah.
Okay, so we now have a longer break. We'll be convening here for lunch at 12:30. The University of St. Thomas, probably about 13 years ago, roughly a year after we came into this building and had a chapel available to us, created a half hour that we call worship time or spiritual nourishment time. So if you're interested in going to Mass, we have Mass in the chapel, which is down the hall this way. If you want to have quiet time for meditation, there's a meditation room at the end of the building on the second floor. If you just want to hang out, you can hang out. But we will not have any structured activity until the end of that time. So we'll be back here for lunch at 12:30. Thank you all. When I first looked at it, I was thinking, right? So once you